Ever find yourself staring at that Made in China tag, kind of wondering how it makes you feel?
Yeah, it's funny how such a small label can get us thinking, huh?
Totally. And you know what's even more interesting? We got sent this really cool study about how news stories, the ones we see every day, they can actually shape how we see those products, and even China itself.
It's like they're secretly influencing us without us even realizing it.
Exactly. So buckle up, dear listeners, because in this deep dive, we're going way beyond that little label and figuring out how the news we consume ends up shaping what we think.
I'm ready to dive in. It's fascinating stuff.
Me too. Now, the study you sent us, it talks about this thing called framing. What exactly is that and why is it so important?
Well, framing, it's like, how do I explain this? Imagine you're looking at a painting and someone shines a spotlight on a specific part. You're naturally drawn to that spot, right?
Yeah, it's like they're highlighting a specific detail.
Precisely. Framing is kind of like that spotlight. It's about emphasizing certain parts of a story, certain angles, to guide your attention in a specific direction.
So it's like two news channels reporting on the same event, but one focuses on the downsides while the other emphasizes the positives.
You got it. And when it comes to Made in China, this study looked at two specific frames they call the risks frame and the benefits frame.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about these risks and benefits frames.
So, the risks frame, it's all about zeroing in on the things that might make you think twice before buying something.
Like what? Give us the nitty gritty.
Well, you've got concerns about product safety, for one. Then there's the whole debate about the impact on jobs here in the US. And we can't forget about the human rights issues that sometimes get tied into the conversation.
Basically, all the reasons someone might hesitate when they see that Made in China label.
Exactly. Now, on the flip side, you've got the benefits frame. This one shines the spotlight on the affordability of products made in China.
Which, let's be real, is a big factor for a lot of people, right?
Absolutely. And to be fair, the quality of Chinese made goods has been steadily improving over the years. Plus, you can't ignore the economic benefits that come with trade between our countries.
Okay, so it's like showing two sides of the same coin. Makes you think about how differently we might view things depending on which side we're looking at. But how did the researchers actually go about studying this? Did they just ask people what they thought about Made in China?
They took it a step further. They actually did an experiment.
Ooh, I love a good experiment. Tell us more.
All right, so they got a bunch of American students together.
A captive audience.
You know it. And they had them read different news articles about, you guessed it, made in China. Some articles were written with that risks angle, others with the benefits angle, and then they had a control group who got just the facts, no added spin whatsoever.
So they were trying to see if just reading those different takes actually changed how people felt about Chinese products and about China in general.
Spot on. They were super interested in how these articles influenced both the perception of made in China, like what comes to mind when you see those words, and the overall attitude towards it.
By attitude, you mean whether people actually like or dislike Made in China.
Exactly. Like, is it something you're drawn to, or do you try to avoid it?
So what did they find? Spill the tea. Did those news stories actually sway people's opinions?
Oh, you bet they did. Get this. Those who read the articles with all the risk talk, they ended up with way more negative views.
Negative about the products themselves or about China overall?
Both. They were less keen on the products and had a less favorable view of China as a whole. And no shocker here, but the opposite happened with the benefits group. They walked away feeling much more positive.
So it's official. The way the news presents things, it really does mess with our heads, doesn't it?
It's powerful stuff. But you know what I find super interesting? They also looked at how our own personal experiences play into all of this.
Okay, so it's not just the news telling us what to think. There's more to it.
Oh, yeah, it gets way more nuanced. Way more. They found that people who'd had good experiences with products made in China, they'd bought something and it worked great, those folks, they were more likely to have a positive attitude overall. Didn't even matter if they read those risk-focused articles.
So like my Made in China laptop that's still going strong after all these years, that actually means something, even if I've seen some negative press.
It totally does. It's like our own experiences, especially the good ones, they can be stronger than whatever we read in the news.
Makes sense. There's something about having that firsthand experience.
It's about trust, right? We trust ourselves and our own judgment more than some article written by who knows who.
Totally. Plus, it's one thing to read about a product failing or whatever, but it's another thing entirely to have used that product every day and have it work perfectly fine.
Exactly. It's like our brains, they latch onto those real life experiences more than abstract ideas. But, it made me think, what about people who haven't really bought a lot of stuff made in China? What shapes their views if they don't have those personal experiences to draw on?
Right, because not everyone's going to have the same experiences. So what did the study say about that?
Well, they looked at something they called personal relevance. Basically, how connected someone feels to China.
Okay, so like maybe they've got family there or they've traveled to China before.
Exactly. And they wanted to see if that personal connection changed how those news stories affected people's opinions.
Did it? Did having that connection to China make people see things differently?
It did. But get this, it wasn't as simple as more personal connection equals totally positive vibes. Instead, having a connection to China seemed to soften the blow of those negative news stories.
Interesting. So even if someone read an article about the downsides of made in China, if they had a friend or family member from China, they might not be as fazed by it.
It's like those personal connections add a whole other layer of context. Think about it this way. If you read a bad news story about a place you've never been, it's easy to just accept it at face value.
You don't really have any other reference point.
Exactly. But if you read a negative story about your hometown, a place you know inside and out, you're less likely to freak out. You understand that there's always more to the story than what the headlines say.
Makes total sense. It's like having a backstage pass. You see the bigger picture.
And that's what's so cool about this study. It shows us how our opinions, they're not just based on one thing. There are all these different factors at play.
It's like a recipe with a bunch of different ingredients,
And sometimes we don't even realize what those ingredients are.
which is kind of worrying, right? Because if we're not aware of what's shaping our opinions, we're basically just going through life on autopilot.
Exactly. But the good news is, now that we are aware of it, thanks to this study, we can start being more critical about the information we come across.
So it's empowering too. We're not powerless in the face of all this information overload.
Totally. And that's super important, especially these days when everyone's got an opinion and they're shouting it from the rooftops.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about how individuals see made in China. But what about the bigger picture? What does all this mean for, say, big companies or even entire countries?
This research, it's huge for them, especially for managing their image.
Mm.
By understanding this whole framing thing, they can be way more strategic about how they talk to the public.
It's like they can't just slap a label on a product and hope for the best anymore.
Nope. They've got to be smart about it. Like, if a company knows that consumers are worried about products being made overseas, they can counteract that by being more upfront about the good stuff they're doing.
So if they're paying their workers fairly and being environmentally conscious, that's something they should be shouting from the rooftops.
100%. Or they could talk about the positive impact they're having on the communities where they operate. It's about controlling the narrative.
Shaping the story. It's like a game of strategy, but instead of trying to outmaneuver your opponent, you're aiming for a win-win where everyone benefits.
I love that. And it's not just businesses that can benefit from this kind of thinking. Think about how our perceptions of made in Japan have totally flipped over the years.
Oh, for sure. It wasn't that long ago that made in Japan meant cheap knockoffs, right? And now it's all about quality and innovation.
Exactly. And that didn't happen by magic. It took a ton of work. Japanese companies, they invested heavily in improving their products and their image.
They decided to change the narrative. It shows that perceptions can change, but it takes effort.
So what about China? They've got a lot of challenges right now in terms of how the world sees them. What can they learn from all of this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
They've come so far in terms of manufacturing, but they're also dealing with these concerns about product safety and labor practices. It's a tough spot to be in. But this research seems to suggest that being open and honest and really committing to ethical practices, those are key to building trust and changing how people see them.
Absolutely. And building a good reputation takes time. There are no shortcuts.
So where does that leave us, the everyday consumers? We're bombarded with news stories, we've got our own experiences, and we're trying to make sense of it all.
It's a lot. But the fact that we're even having this conversation, that we're aware of these things, it means we're already a step ahead.
Awareness is key. So the next time you see that Made in China label, maybe take a second to think about what's driving your reaction.
Exactly. Ask yourself, where did I get this information? Is it reliable? Am I letting my biases take over?
And don't be afraid to do your own research. Read different perspectives. Talk to people who have different viewpoints.
Challenge those assumptions.
It's like we're on a quest for knowledge.
Totally. And who knows what we'll uncover along the way.
It's funny. We've been talking about made in China for a while now, and it's got me thinking about how much I rely on like mental shortcuts. I see that label and boom, all these associations pop into my head.
It's like our brains are hardwired to do that. We see a pattern and we make a snap judgment. It's how we're built.
Totally. And here's the thing, those shortcuts, they don't always lead us in the right direction.
Especially not in this day and age when things are so complicated. But hey, at least now we're aware of it, right?
Exactly. And that awareness, it's like a superpower. Once we recognize those shortcuts, we can actually start to question them.
We can decide if those snap judgments are actually right or if we need to dig a little deeper.
So it's about being more than just a sponge, soaking up information. We've got to be active participants in how we see the world.
Love that. Be curious, ask questions, and don't be afraid to have your mind changed.
And speaking of curious minds, a huge shout out to you, our amazing listeners. You're the ones who sent in this research because you're already thinking about these things.
You're already one step ahead of the game.
So as you go about your day and you see that Made in China label, and trust me, you'll see it everywhere. Think back to what we talked about today.
Remember that the news can be sneaky with its framing, that your own experiences matter more than you think, and that's okay to question everything.
It's like we've unlocked a secret level of awareness. We could be smarter consumers, more informed citizens, and, just generally more open-minded people.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And you know what? While we're on the subject of made in China and hidden surprises, did you know that some of the most advanced microchips out there, the ones that power our smartphones and computers and all that, you ready for this? They're actually designed using software, wait for it, developed in China. It's a small world after all, huh? If you want more mind-blowing deep dives like this one, make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel. We've got a whole lot more to explore together.